Today's video is going to be a very simple kind of basics tutorial on what it means when photographers talk about ISO or ISO. Specifically, we're going to get into kind of what it means now. This is not going to be an entirely technical video. I'm going to give some good intuitions on how you can think about it, and probably there are going to be people who would disagree with my descriptions from a highly technical standpoint, but I think if you think about it the way I'm going to present it, it'll be a good way to understand the basics of ISO. This video is going to be a little bit different. I'm going to be testing some gear that I'm going to use for the upcoming semester, where I'll be a teaching assistant. So this is really more a dry run for me than anything else. But you know, getting a video out every week is good to keep in a rhythm. So let's get into it then. ISO is part of what is known as the exposure triangle, right? So you have your ISO, you've got your shutter speed, and then you have your aperture. Okay, and so these are the three things that contribute to your exposure, so how light or dark a particular image is. So today we're going to kind of, we're only going to talk about aperture and shutter speed in reference to how they're affected by your ISO. So what is ISO, or ISO as some people call it? This is basically the sensitivity of your sensor. And that's kind of a misnomer, but that's a good way to think about it, right? So what do we mean when we say sensitivity, right? So our sensors are made up of little pixels, right? And in fact, each pixel is subdivided into 4 subpixels, I guess. And basically, the way most sensors are set up, and this is a Bayer filter is what this is called, is that you have 2 green subpixels, and you have a blue and a red. And so the blue, red, and green, I'm just going to assume it's these top ones, represents the color information, and then this extra green here is used to capture luminance information. But so this gets translated into 1 pixel. Right. Now, we can think of the light coming in as numbers, and they're measured in, I think the standard unit is lux, but let's just abstract that away. Let's ignore the units, right? So let's say we get a 0.1, 0.1, and 2.5s, right? Okay, so if we have this as our pixel, let's assume it's black and white. Right, so for sake of argument, let's say to get the black and white luminance value, you average all of them. Right, so that's 1.2 over 4, which will give us a 0.3 luminance. Okay, so let's say this is at 100 ISO, which is usually the lowest ISO you can get on most cameras. Some will do 50. But most will do 100. And there are a few tricks you can do to get falsely low ISOs. We're going to ignore those. Okay, so that's at 100 ISO. So if we have, so we're talking about sensitivity, and essentially the way to think about it is that as you increase the ISO, you multiply the values. So if we have 100 ISO pixel, and we'll use the same numbers. So we have 100 ISO pixel. And it's still got 0.1, 0.5, and 0.5, right? Now, let's say that we double the ISO. So we want to see what would this look like if we were at 200 ISO. And what you can think about that is that we multiply by 2 each of the values, right? So that's going to give us 0.2, 0.2, and then we'll have 1.0 and 1.0, right? And so this, let's say we're doing our black and white again, just for simplicity's sake, right? So we have 2 and 2.4, and that's divided by 4, and that's obviously going to give us 0.6. So as we can see, when we look at these values here, by doubling our ISO, we doubled how bright it was. And that's basically all ISO does, is by increasing ISO, you make the image brighter. Some people like to talk about it as like artificial light, right? Now, this is not super accurate for like this is not a super technical thing, but it's good to imagine ISO as basically what you multiply the values on your sensor by. So the higher the ISO, the brighter they are, because larger values are brighter, right? So where does this come in? So let's say we have a shutter speed of 1/100th of a second, right? At ISO 100, right? And that produces some value. Let's use our 0.3, right? If we move this up to 200 ISO, right, we would get our 0.6. But suppose we really want that 0.3, right? So 0.6 is too bright for us for this particular pixel, right? So what this means that we can do is, if we have ISO 200, then we can shoot at 1/200th of a second, right? Because what happens is, because our shutter speed is twice as fast, we're going to get half the light. So ISO 200 at 1/200th is going to produce 0.3 for our value. Right. So as just kind of the gist of it is, as we increase our ISO, we can decrease our shutter speed. Right? And every time we double ISO or double our shutter speed, right, that's what's considered one stop. So one stop is equal to twice as much light. And of course, this can go in the other direction. So negative one stop is half as much light, right? So ISO and shutter speed are the easy ones, because you double ISO, you go up a stop. You have your shutter speed, you go down one stop. So where does aperture come in, right? So aperture is a little bit weird, because it's actually about the area inside of this circle. So apertures work on units of square root of 2, and we're not really going to get into it, but basically if you increase by a square root of 2, that's equal to 1 stop of aperture. So as you increase your ISO, you can shoot with a smaller aperture as you would stop down. Okay. So that's the basic relation between ISO, shutter speed, and aperture. Is as you increase the ISO, you can decrease your shutter speed, well, make your shutter speed faster, and you can stop down your aperture. So that brings us to the other point. Why not shoot at the highest ISO? And there's some good reasons. The first one is you might not be able to compensate. Right? So if your camera only goes to 1/4000th of a second shutter speed, and for this particular image, you're at, say, 100 ISO, right? If you bump it up to 200, then this is not, you can't go any farther, right? So you can't do 1/8000th of a second at 200 because the camera just doesn't do that, right? So that's one reason why you might choose a lower ISO number. Now, here's the main reason that a lot of people choose lower ISO is noise. So a good way to think about this, let's go back to our little pixel examples, right? And let's say we can only read one decimal place, right? So this is going to be at 100. And we have 0.01, 0.01. We'll keep our 0.5s here, right? At 100 ISO, right? So let's say we do this kind of rounding. Well, suppose after ISO is applied, we round everything to the nearest tenth, right? So that'll give us a 0 here, a 0 here, and our 2.5s, right? So this is going to be a relatively dark pixel. Let's do our black and white conversion. So it's 1/4, so it'll give us a 0.25, right? Now, let's say we take this and we do it at 300, or, you know, let's do it at 1,000. Okay, so we're at 1,000 ISO, which means we multiply everything here by 10, right? Let's get our little pixel. And now we have 0.1 and 0.1, and then we have 5 and 5, right? And then we have the same rounding step, right? So this ISO is also called gain, right? And there's analog and digital gain, and there's a whole mess. I'll leave a link in the description to a good video by Tony Northrup, where he discusses the intimate details of ISO and what's called ISO invariance. I'm not going to get into that for now. But so here, after our rounding, we have 0.1, 5, 5, and 0.1, right? So when we add all these up, that's 10.2 over 4. And that is going to give us some mess. So if you will give me 1 second. Okay. So coming back, it'll give us 2.55, right? And the key here is that these don't match up exactly, right? So if increasing the ISO by 10 times, you would expect that we would instead get 2.5, right? But we have this extra 0.05, and that's noise, right? That's part of the signal that we don't necessarily want. And that's what happens. When you increase the sensitivity, there are times when you get signals that wouldn't have been read otherwise because you're picking out the minutia, right? And I think the best way to show this is to show two images, one with a low ISO and one with a high ISO. So let's go do that. Here we have a unedited raw file. And as you can see, there's really no noise. All the whites are white, all the blacks are black, all the reds are red. There's no signals that are kind of disturbed in this. And it's not the crispest picture because this is just a straight raw right out of the camera, but this is what 100 ISO looks like. Moving over to the high ISO, this is taken at 40,000 ISO, so the complete opposite end of the spectrum. And in order to take this photo, I actually had to dim the lights and then increase my shutter speed quite significantly. But what we see here is you see these magentas and these greens that really don't belong in the photo. And you know, this is similarly cropped. It's the same setup, just dimmer lights. But there's a lot more noise in this photo because we're using a higher ISO. That's an elementary explanation of ISO. So now you know a little bit more about ISO and where it fits into the exposure triangle. Yeah, so really the main effect of ISO is just more ISO typically denotes more noise. There's going to be somebody who's going to yell at me about that, but that's a good way to think about it, right? Is it's multiplying those values on your sensor, and so they're appearing brighter, even though there's not more light in the scene. It's just that the little minutia is getting picked up. And a little bit of ISO is not bad, and a little bit of noise is not going to kill you. But cranking your ISO value up over 100,000 on the regular is going to give you some images that look a little like Swiss cheese from time to time, right? And what we were discussing when we were discussing noise, because we were doing our little pseudo black and white filters, is basically black and white noise, luminance noise, as it's called in some editors. But there's also chromatic noise, right, where the reds and the greens and the blues are off. And that usually shows up in a lot of images as kind of a green purple kind of speckling when you zoom in, right? So yeah, if you use a low ISO, which is typical in landscape photography because you're usually on a tripod, so you don't care about your shutter speed, because if it's on a tripod, you're not going to get shake, or you shouldn't get shake. There are still certain conditions where you can get shake, like in an earthquake or if it's really windy out. But generally speaking, you're not worried about shutter speed when you've got the camera locked off on a tripod. So landscape photography typically taken at about 100 ISO or whatever the lowest ISO is, because that's going to decrease your noise. And by decreasing your noise, you're increasing your detail, because removing noise will remove detail, and typically you don't want too much noise in your photos. So yeah, that's everything there is to do. Well, not everything. That's everything you need to know about ISO in order to take some decent landscape photos. All right, well, roll the outro.